Hello to everyone. I'm Marykate.cassidy from HOK in our Chicago office. I'm a designer here, and this whole topic on neurodiversity really started with a simple question from one of our clients when they asked us, how can we accommodate neurodivergence in the workplace? Specifically, someone came to us asking about someone with ADHD. And so from there, for the last 3 years at HOK, we have really been evolving our range of research. And so this is just kind of a glimpse of what's been going on at HOK, really headed up by Kay Sargent, our director of workplace in our DC office. So what we know is that 1 in 7 people are considered to be neurodiverse, but fewer than 50% know it. And, we think of people that we know throughout history that we consider to be geniuses, that we know are neurodiverse, and we think of it as more of a superpower. We know that when spaces are not designed to accommodate people who are neurodiverse, which is really a spectrum that we are all included in, they just simply can't function in the wrong environment. So I love this quote that we got from an autistic student. We are freshwater fish in salt water. Put us in fresh water and we function just fine. Put us in salt water and we struggle to survive. It really explains perfectly when you are not designing for the appropriate surroundings, you just simply can't thrive in that environment. And, we sometimes think of neurodiverse conditions as a diagnosed condition, such as ADHD, the autism spectrum, even anxiety, depression. But especially since the pandemic, we've found that everyone has a heightened sensitivity to their surroundings and to the built environment. So we all find ourselves somewhere on the spectrum. And I think in general, we like to think of IQ when we think about intelligence, but what we've learned over the years, and especially in the last few years with our research, is that we need to evaluate sensory intelligence as a spectrum and design accordingly. So we think about this as a spectrum with neurotypical in the center. On one end is hypersensitive. These are people who basically prefer less sensory stimuli. They're more sensitive to stimuli in the environment. So they prefer more controlled, predictable environments, less bright, vibrant colors, less acoustic distractions, less visual distractions. Where on the other end of the spectrum is hyposensitive people. These are people that basically need more sensory stimuli. They have difficulty processing the very acute details of stimuli. And so they like spaces that are a lot more active, that have more vibrant colors, variation in pattern, texture, more acoustic distractions or stimuli, as well as visual. And we know that, depending on the situation, some people will find themselves at one end of the spectrum in some situations and in another in different situations. So it's all a spectrum. We all find ourselves somewhere on it. This is just giving an example of some visuals of the overstimulated people might prefer more hypersensitive environments. You can see in these images more emphasis on biophilia, nature, softer tones and colors, predictable environments that are pretty limited in their palette, where for the understimulated, people would prefer more of a hyposensitive environment where you're seeing a wide range of textures, colors, patterns, a very engaging environment. And so we think of all the different senses when we're designing for the spectrum, because it's important to understand hypersensitive versus hyposensitive, but it's also important to go into the details that translate so clearly into design elements. So how things sound, what they look like, feel like, smell like, how close or far away you are to someone or to your surroundings. And then we think of it as a matrix. So at the top of the screen here, you see the spectrum that I explained, hyposensitive to hypersensitive. And then on the left-hand side, you see all the different senses. And we really think of it as this design matrix. Someone at the very top left square, for example, who's hyposensitive, when it comes to auditory stimuli, they're going to want the most of it. They're going to want a louder, more engaging environment where maybe there's a lot of people talking around or there's music playing. It's very active. Where if you think of like the second row all the way on the right-hand side, hypersensitive for visual, someone who's hypersensitive to any visual stimuli is not going to want to have a lot of people walking by. You're not going to be wanting to be sitting on the main circulation path. You're going to be wanting to be tucked away and less distracted by any visual stimuli that's happening around you. And so we think through all of these kind of different segments throughout this matrix that we study and think, how does this all incorporate into one building or one office? So again, the spectrum on the left here that you see from hypersensitive to hyposensitive, it's also very important to identify different space types. So we think through 6 very specific space types when it comes to the workplace. And we think through what the design for each of those spaces would be for a hypersensitive person. So you look at this very first bubble in the top left. It's very easy to think of a hypersensitive space for a focused task, because focused and concentrative tasks will typically be a one-person task. So you might think of kind of secluding yourself off the beaten path, having an environment that's available for just one person, that limits any distraction that's happening around you. But we also need to think of those same types of spaces at the other end of the spectrum. So, just because I need to do a focused, singular, heads down task doesn't mean that I need to lock myself away in a phone room away from everyone else. If I'm hyposensitive, I want to be able to do a singular task, but still be out in the open. So we need to think about different tasks that people are doing throughout the day. And it's not just one, it's moving from meeting to meeting or task to task, and think about how to design those spaces specifically for both ends of the spectrum. And so altogether, those spaces, 12 that I just mentioned, 6 for one end of the spectrum, 6 for the other, need to all live in the same office. We can't just have an office designed one way or the other. So we think of it as an ecosystem made up of all of these different, design interventions for hypersensitive people versus hypo. And I think something that's really interesting is it's easy to think of a singular space, designing it for someone who's hyper versus hypo, because you could think of a phone room and you could think, okay, someone who's hyposensitive is going to want a lot of texture and color in that space. You might want more fidget furniture in that space so you can walk around, have a lot of movement, be able to customize it very easily for music or light. And, it's easy to think of those spaces, but what about our shared spaces? So what about the all hands areas for all hands meetings or happy hours at the end of the day in an office? You need to have an area where you can gather everyone together, but not everyone will have the same sensory preferences. So I think it's very important to consider zones within each space. If you have a social gathering space, as you can see in this diagram, maybe there's a stairway or maybe there's banquettes tucked over to the side, where someone who's a little bit more hypersensitive to their environment can tuck themselves away, maybe in a banquette with lower lighting, lower ceiling, more acoustic material around them, but they're still able to participate in the overall event that's happening with a large group of people. And so I'm not going to get, I know we're running a quick program today, so I'm not going to get into the details of all of this, but HOK has all the research on exactly what design elements should go into each of these spaces. So the 6 types of tasks that I mentioned are shown here, starting with a focus or concentrated space. And as I flip through, you'll see the pink and the blue bubbles kind of shifting around this axon diagram. And what that's representing is the space that we're referring to. And then on the right-hand side, we've detailed out what are the best colors to design for in a space like this? What are the best materials, patterns, and things to consider like that. So again, just talking through different types of spaces, focus or processing spaces, which might be where you're spending the majority of your day doing, work at a workstation, for example, or creative spaces where you need to be collaborative, either in an enclosed environment or out in the open. Meeting spaces, whether it's a meeting out in the open or whether it's in a traditional kind of conference room that's more enclosed. Refresh spaces where you can go in between meetings to just kind of reset before the next event. And again, social spaces, really thinking through how to design for both types of people while participating in one event together. And what's important when you think about an ecosystem is, okay, we have all of these different spaces that we need to consider and all of these different design considerations. They need to all live in one office or one building. And zoning is really important because you can't just have a super active social space right next to a very quiet phone room. So the zoning is important and the transition is very important, going from, formal collaborative spaces to open collaborative spaces. spaces that are quieter than others versus spaces that are a lot more active and maybe louder. So breaking those up and being, conscious of the transition from moving from space to space is something that we study very often and very important. So something that I love is recently HOK has been partnering with Target to really dive into a more kind of minute level of detail around this topic. And what's great about that is, architects and designers, we can preach this information on, and we can really understand how spaces should be designed and try to push that in our design. But we really need our manufacturer partners to be on the same page and understand the importance and create the appropriate products to support all the research and the design that we're trying to achieve. So we've been going more in depth, especially this last winter with Target, to really do a specific study on exactly what people need. So studying different neurominorities. Previously in our research, we know that women had been underrepresented. So really targeting women more, targeting very specific neurominorities to find out exactly what's important. And I think what's great about the findings is we've learned that the majority of people are going to react hypersensitive in most situations. You can see 47% versus the 22% for hyposensitive. As I mentioned, depending on the task and depending on the situation, people might prefer more hypersensitive things in some situations where they're more at the other end of the spectrum in other situations. But we should assume, especially because we've spent so much time being at home in our own customizable environments, that moving back into a shared environment, more people are going to feel hypersensitive to their environments rather than, craving a ton of stimuli and craving a lot of unpredictable environments. So for workplace specifically, during the polls and the research we've done over the last few months, we found that while we know that people will be mostly hypersensitive, they will be, we're trying to figure out exactly what kind of stimuli they'll be hypersensitive to. And we're finding that 77%, as you can see here, is due to auditory stimuli, so noise. And that's not really a surprise because we've been able to be on calls on speakerphone in our houses, in our private office or room or tucked away, and not really have to worry about background noise or someone else being on a conversation right next to you on another conference call. So auditory is the biggest sensory challenge that we're seeing going back and returning into the office, with visual following closely after. And, we also are trying to dive into variances between different age groups. So here we're showing the under 30 group, the 30 to 60 and over 60. And I think the differences that we're finding are very directly tied to the tasks that these people of different age groups are doing. So we find that the under 30 group is spending more time congregating and socializing, where that middle group of 30 to 60 is spending most time contemplating and needing refresh space in between meetings. The over 60 group is spending more time in group settings, learning, contemplating, socializing. So I think that has a lot to do with the tasks that these age groups are performing. And, as you mature and develop different roles and responsibilities through your job, we have to think through not only the tasks that people are doing, but the difference in, the formal process of how you're performing those tasks is completed. So the 10 design strategies that we're outlining here that would be takeaways, a lot of these I don't think will be groundbreaking. It's something that architects and designers have been talking about for a while, like choice and options throughout spaces, natural daylight, spaces to move. That's all continues to be very important as we talk about designing for inclusivity and neurodiversity. I think some that's really interested is these spaces to have areas to retreat to. We can think about each task that we have to do through the day, and we often do day in the life studies, trying to, imagine what a neurodivergent who's hypersensitive, who's maybe in marketing, for example, what their day in the life would be and what spaces they would need throughout their schedule throughout the day. But what's important is really those spaces to retreat in between the meetings. So there's this philosophy that Kay Sargent, my colleague, likes to speak about, that we should work the way that athletes train. So athletes tend to work in 90-minute spurts where, they'll perform their tasks that they need to do and then have a little break to be able to recharge, reset, and prepare for the next event. It's unrealistic to think that we can ask our clients and their employees to return to the office and sit down and work for 4 hours straight, take a quick lunch break, and then work again for 4 hours straight. It's unrealistic, just the way that our brains work. And we know that it's important to have those breaks between spurts of meetings or different tasks that we're doing to reset and recharge, retreat before moving on to the next space or task. And so, this goes beyond, we can, as architects and designers, we can design the space accordingly, but there's also the level of operational strategies that has to be layered on top of that. So we list out 7 here. Again, you can see number 5, the ability to have intermittent breaks between tasks. That's so important, and that comes from the top, and a message that's important to, I think, really enforce as we return to the office and the built environment. But as far as operational strategies, awareness training for people to understand neurodiversity. It's been a fairly new term over the last few years, and it's important for everyone to understand that everyone has a different sensory preference. Flexible work. We know that a lot of our clients are moving back to flexible or hybrid strategies, but for some people who are at the most severe ends of being hyper or hyposensitive, especially hypersensitive, it might just not make sense to return to the office. So creating spaces where you can collaborate with someone who's remote while other people are together physically. That all goes with flex hours. Maybe IT is providing noise canceling headphones because we heard that auditory is the major sensory stimuli distraction. And the idea, I think number 7 is really important operationally too. The idea for clear booking and reservations of meeting rooms, because we can design all these spaces, but if people don't feel like they can use the spaces to customize to their schedule to really benefit from the opportunities that a well-space designed provides, then the office isn't useful if it can't be booked or reserved. So key takeaways, as I mentioned, just to reiterate here, choice, control, none of that is new, but quiet is very important because we're hearing from our research that really is the main driver that will be a main distraction going back to the office. Movement is important, especially for creative zones, whether it's furniture that provides movement or different postures, but also just to be able to have spaces maybe for walking meetings or movement throughout the space. Daylight, we know, adjustments to be able to, really customize the space to work for you, and zoning, as I mentioned, that transition between spaces is really key. And so, one of my colleagues likes to say, when you design for the extreme, you benefit the means. And I love that because our research really started looking at some of the most, extreme ends of the spectrum and of the neurominorities that we were really honing into. And that gave us a very clear correlation for how to design. So when you talk to someone who's on the autism spectrum, they're able to tell you very specific needs that they have. I can't function if I'm not in a room with dim lighting or facing this way, facing a window, or away from this type of noise. And those needs translate directly into design. And when we design for those most extreme needs, you benefit the mean. So I think, obviously there's a compelling human case to everything that we're saying, but there's also a very compelling business case to this, because the more that we're designing these spaces that help people to be productive and help people to be successful, they will boost the productivity of the business. And there's a very compelling business case behind that. So again, I just wanted to, leave you with all of the research that we've done to date. Thank you all for listening. It was great to be a part of this discussion today.